right, well, we want to welcome everyone to Communication Across the Curriculum, or CAC, today. And it's a great honor to welcome Jeff Groh from the Math Department, who has written a new book, South Bottom, Virginia During the Civil War. And Jeff initially made a presentation here a few years ago when he just started to go through the notes that you had and the records, the family records, and now it's a book. And congratulations.
Well, thank you.
And
Labor of love.
based on what I've read of it, I think it'll make a great film.
I think
So,
it'll be nice.
So it's all yours, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you for coming today. This is the site on Amazon, and they've given you a colon here, should be a comma. I had no input into that, but it is South Bottom, Virginia. South Bottom is an area in Virginia. Okay, so not South Bottom and then colon, Virginia during the Civil War. That's not exactly appropriate. But South Bottom, which is what I affectionately titled the book, in terms of a single word, you can see here, is an historical novel telling the true story of two brothers who fought on both sides of the American Civil War. Jack and Sam Groh were both swept into the Confederate Army. They were both in the Confederate Army. The Stonewall Brigade, through their membership in the Virginia Militia. They both deserted the Confederate Army and hid in the Blue Ridge Mountains for a year, suffering cold, confronting a mountain lion, this according to granddaughter, okay. Evading the home guard, and finding themselves involved in shootouts, two shootouts, with members of the Provost Guard who attempted to arrest them. During one such episode, his fellow deserter and friend was killed at the homestead, and he was actually buried in the family cemetery. Fleeing to West Virginia, the Groh brothers enlisted in the Union Army, for which they fought until the end of the war. South Bottom is a meticulously documented American tale of great courage and sacrifice in the struggle for freedom. So that's my little blurb beginning of the book. I don't know, there are some reviews that I have down here with the ratings. So, the second one says, puts you right in the boots of men who fought in the American Civil War. And that was one of my goals in writing the book. This was not to be a story about the generals and the colonels and whatnot, and the great decisions. This was small history. This is at the boots level. So, puts you right in the boots of men who fought in the American Civil War. The blood, the carnage, the depredation, even the emotional stress. Plus its historical accuracy in thousands of times and places. Take you all back to the time as if you were there. And another one, this is an exciting, true story, account of two brothers, sons of the South, who sacrificed everything to defy the Confederacy, giving up family, property, and love, to stand up for their fervent belief that slavery is evil. Well-researched and documented, this account, presented as historical fiction, follows the Groh brothers over the precipice of the Civil War, in which no family in the small farming burg of South Bottom, Virginia, remains unscarred by the bloody events that transpire. Forced to serve in Stonewall Jackson's army, the brothers eventually desert and make their way to the north, not only fleeing the murderous chicanery of the defenders of slavery, but resolutely signing up with the Northern Army to return once again to the South, this time as the enemy. Strangers in a strange land that they once called home. Most exciting is the actual wanted poster. I'll show you that eventually. So, this is my set of slides for today. And what I'd like to do today is I'd like to take you through the process that I went through learning about this story. Because when I started, I knew essentially nothing. I had heard vaguely from my father that some ancestor of mine, didn't know his name, he didn't know his name, had been part of the Confederate Army and had apparently deserted, possibly even going to the Union side. That's literally all I knew. Okay, that's everything that I knew. And I obviously have learned a substantial amount more. I had never done genealogical research before, so this is a new area for me. Had never done historical research, required a lot of reading. And so there I was, tabula rasa. Okay. Just a blank slate. So I thought this was going to be easy. All I have to do is get their compiled military service records from the National Archives, right? Should be there. So you'd go on their site, send them your $30 per record, okay? And they send you a little CD and it comes back and it has almost no part of their record in there. It's almost, it had very little of their actual records that was included there. This was a great disappointment to me that I waited months for. And so a trip to the National Archives was absolutely required in order to come up with anything. I also, since you just don't jump in the car and go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., started doing some genealogical research. And this first, focused on family, but made a family search account, used Ancestry.com, U.S. Census records, but eventually I came to believe that I needed to understand the relationships between everyone in the community. So I needed to know how they were related backwards in time and also forwards in time from the Civil War era. So I wanted to know who knew whom, who lived next to who married who, how are they all related to each other? Because you don't know. I mean, you may be thinking this guy is an enemy, but his wife might have been a relative, right? Which was literally the case in certain instances. Of course, you have the internet available to you these days, so I found immigration records from the 1740s, finding the Gru line coming over from, they were Palatines, so they came over from Rotterdam and sailed across the Atlantic, arriving in Philadelphia, where they settled in Pennsylvania initially. I found the military service for their grandfather for the Pennsylvania militia during the Revolutionary War. And also their father was at the National Archives. I found the records for his father and his father's three brothers, their records for service in the War of 1812. So found quite a lot there. You can find certain muster records for military units online, which helps you learn the names of everyone, including when they arrived in the unit, which was important in studying things like who was at Harper's Ferry and how did they vote for secession. Because I knew who was there, and I found out how everyone voted, who did vote, but I also wanted to know, well, who didn't vote? Okay, so there was more to it. One really fine resource is created by the University of Virginia. It's called the Valley of the Shadow Project. And they have a lot of different records located on that website. It has census records for the area, tax records, some military records, and also, interestingly, slave census records. Okay, so you can get an idea of who had how many slaves, whatnot. They also have slave tax records. Turns out owning a slave in Virginia in the antebellum period was considered kind of sin, so you paid a sort of sin tax. And even though later on people would fight very vigorously to preserve slavery, that's kind of how it was viewed in the antebellum period. Also, there are certain newspaper records, a little bit, but that was a little bit intriguing to me. I wanted to find more newspaper records, so you get that through the Library of Congress. There is a genealogical section at the Library of Conroe, which is a truly fine resource. It's, the whole floor of the building there is pretty much genealogical records. Also, I found out that in terms of the Library of Conroe, they have interlibrary loan with other places. And I was able to get some microfilm from the University of Virginia containing court documents from Augusta County's circuit court from the antebellum and that era. So that was also a very fine resource. I could get. There's also, I went to the University of Houston Library. I went to the library at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. They have original documents there, deeds and whatnot, you can pull. And you're looking at these little scripts of paper which people wrote on the boundaries of the property 200 years ago. It's a 200-year-old sheet of paper. However, the best records I found online, they have a lot of the circuit court records online as well. You can search them. They're searchable. So not only was I able to get the microfilm from the library in Conroe, but also able to search some of these records online, which was a really fine resource. Now, I had to go to the National Archives 3 times. You go there first and you think you know what you need. You obtain some records. And let me tell you, some of the records, obtaining some of those records was like pulling teeth at times. When you go to the National Archives, you go through a training program lasting about 20 minutes, and they issue you then a researcher's card. And then you can go access their records. And the first time I went, I just obtained compiled military service records. One of them was very difficult to obtain because they couldn't find it for hours. And they pride themselves in not losing things at the National Archives. They really do. And so they were really frustrated themselves at not being able to find this record.
Did you find anything in Trump's house?
Well, I was looking for, I knew that my great-great-grandfather had served in the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery as part of his Union service. But I also knew that in March of 1865, he was, unfortunately for himself, transferred to the 4th U.S. Volunteer Infantry, which shipped him out to the Dakota Territories, which was a remarkable journey if you think about it, because here he was in Fortress Monroe in Virginia, serving in the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, and he was actually serving before Richmond, where his post was. But they call him back and they say, you're transferred, you're going to be over here. He goes to Norfolk, gets on a boat, takes the steamboat to New York, gets out, takes a train. The train crosses the country to St. Louis, and from there they get on riverboats. They travel 750 miles on riverboats up the Missouri River to Sioux City, Iowa, and from there they march 150 miles and then another 150 miles, 300 miles total, to get to the fort in the Dakota Territories, where that winter the time at shift, the time at watch was limited to 11 minutes so that you didn't freeze to death. So, anyway, it was not a choice assignment. Okay. Not exactly. But he wasn't released until the 20th of November, 1865. So he didn't have to go through the whole winter. So, yeah, I got the compiled military service records. They spent hours finding those records for the 4th U.S. Volunteer Infantry, which was in the Dakota Territories, and the reason is that the recruitment for that unit was from principally former Confederate soldiers. And so they actually put those records together with the Confederate soldiers' records. And they were looking for the 4th U.S. Infantry. That's as a Union unit, right? They looked for those for hours and couldn't find them. Finally, I told them, well, you know, these were mostly galvanized Yankees. And then they understood, aha, galvanized Yankees. This was a term that they used back then for former Confederate soldiers who had a small, thin, galvanized layer of Yankee on them, but they were still Confederate underneath. So it was a term of derision. Okay. Even though my great-great-grandfather has risked his life to leave the Confederate Army and join the Union Army.
So there wasn't that much trust between them, that much.
No. And most of them you couldn't trust. The largest losses in the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery were due to desertions. And most of that was just former Confederate soldiers who had joined the Union Army, had just walked off and gone home.
They joined the Union Army and
They
then
joined
walked
the
off and
Union
went home.
Army.
Yeah.
So they left home.
They what? You see, they were in Virginia because they were in Fort Monroe.
Right,
And so home is like a county or two over.
right.
All they have to do is walk.
So they
Deserted the Union Army and went back to went back home. So I had other objectives at the National Archives at other times. One time I wanted to find the records for the commanding officers of the various units that they had belonged to, because that gives you more detail. Because often they'll have a lot more detail with the colonel of the particular regiment than you do with the grunt soldier. And I also needed to find medical records from the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, which my great-great-grandfather's brother joined as part of his Union service. They had a very, very rough service, the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. When they started south, they gathered on the 3rd of May, 1864, and they were really marching all night. They arrived at the Rapidan, the river, across the river at Ely's Ford at 6 a.m. on the morning of the 4th. Grant's traditional overland campaign began on the 4th of May, 1864. They were gathering up that evening. They had 1,000 men. And the adjutant wrote that when they marched that night, they had 722 muskets in the regiment. That means 722 men carrying muskets, because they referred to these guys as muskets. Who are the other people, right? They're people on the wagon train. Right? These are not your frontline soldiers. People in the ambulance corps, people in the staff. Okay, so you have a lot of people that run various aspects of the regiment that are not carrying rifles on the front line. Though Sam was one of those grunts carrying a rifle on the front line. And by 5.5 months later, the adjutant reported by October 15th, they were down to 182 muskets. Okay. So they saw some fairly severe service. Later that month, on the 29th of October, they lost 33 killed in the raid of the 100, which was a suicide raid that they were assigned. They were told by their brigadier that they had a very dangerous assignment that they didn't need to take part in, but every soldier in the regiment volunteered. So they picked 100 of them, and they sent these men to attack a point on the Confederate line in Petersburg. Now, the reason why they were sent was purely as a distraction, because Grant had intended to attack 2 other points south of Petersburg to cut off Confederate supply lines. So Grant wanted to fix Lee's eyes on this point in the line, and so he had these guys thrown out there like chaff. And when they were surprised actually that they captured the fort that they attacked. The reason they captured it is that they were given Spencer repeating rifles, so they could shoot 7 shots before having to reload, which gave them a lot more firepower than the Confederates had opposing them. They actually captured that spot, only to have Confederates reinforce and come back and drive them out. The captain, Jeremiah Brown, asked the brigadier why they didn't receive reinforcements, because he kind of felt like they had just done what they had been trying to do for a whole year, all year, and that is puncture a line in the line at Petersburg, send reinforcements up, and just roll up the Confederate line. If they had only received reinforcements, because they had captured the line. The brigadier told him, "Frankly, Captain, we never expected a single one of you to cross that line or to return." That's the sort of rough service these guys were given. Not the only time they were given up as just lost. Earlier in the campaign, the entire regiment of 1,000 men was given up as just lost. The order to retreat had been lost in fires of battle, and they were nearly destroyed by 2 attacking Confederate divisions against this one regiment. So I told you about the medical records that I wanted to get at the National Archives. When you go to the National Archives and you ask for the carded medical records for any particular regiment, they have records of everyone who ever went to a field hospital or an army hospital during the Civil War, which is kind of phenomenal when you think about it. And I knew that Sam Groves, part of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, had been wounded at the Battle of the Po River, but I didn't know the nature of the wound. I knew this because his wounding was recorded in the regimental history. It's 1,200 pages. Somewhere in the very back in the appendix, he's in there, and I found him in there, and it says he was wounded at the Battle of the Po, but it didn't say how. So I wanted to know what happened. So I found out about the existence of these carded medical records at the National Archives. I went, but the thing is, they want you to commit to scanning an entire section because they won't allow you to scan one individual's records. So I had to do 300 scans over the course of 2 days. And finally came to the realization that he had never been to a field hospital or an army hospital for any reason, not even sickness. A lot of guys had gone to the army hospital for dysentery. One of his young fellow soldiers in the 148th was wounded at the Po by being shot just above the knees, a little 18-year-old kid, Israel Grenoble. He had to have it amputated. And Israel Grenoble writes about this amputation. He says that when they did this, they left 4 inches of bone sticking out. And he said that eventually sloughed off. But he kept on having problems with gangrene. And as an 18-year-old kid, he's in the army hospital. He's in there for a year. He figures out eventually that, the nurses are taking a basin and they're washing this guy's wound. Sure, they dump the water out, but they take the same basin filled with fresh water to the next guy. And he decided, and this is before the germ theory of disease, right? He decided he was going to demand that he have his own basin and that he would clean his own wounds. And after that, he didn't get gangrene again. So, kind of a remarkable 18-year-old kid back in 1865.
But your relative really was never wounded?
He was wounded, but he never went to the
You
hospital.
never went to the hospital?
There were a lot of people who were wounded who never went to the hospital. There are certain things that he could not do as a former Confederate soldier working with the Union Army. He could never be captured.
So could he not go to the hospital?
I probably could, but he could not be captured for any reason, because if he did, he would not be a prisoner of war. He would be summarily shot.
Did you bring the one in
It's in here.
Is it?
Yeah. Yes.
Get it.
So
Sorry.
I went to the Library of Virginia in Richmond. I had learned of the existence of certain exemptions from the Confederate draft. I wanted to see if anyone in the family had applied for an exemption to the Confederate draft. And so I went down there and I copied took photos of all these records. And then you don't have time to sit and read the records when you're there. You have to just photocopy them. And it turns out it came up empty. No one in the family, no one in the neighborhood had applied for an exemption to the Confederate draft. But it's like in science, a null result is still a result. Right? The fact that you didn't find something actually is telling you something. Okay. I also, at another time at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, I found the poll books for the secession vote. Now, polls were not handled back then the way they are now. They didn't have a secret ballot. So if you went to cast your vote, you went and there was a person, a scribe, sitting there with a poll book. And for a particular proposition like secession, you have one side for those who vote for and one side for those who vote against. And if you vote for, you tell the person sitting at the desk with the poll book how you wish to vote, and they write very neatly, very legibly, your name. And it's recorded forever how you voted. And I knew of the existence of these through my researches on the internet, and so I wanted to see them. How did everyone in their community vote for secession? Because they had these poll books for all those soldiers who had, the militiamen who had gathered up at Harper's Ferry and were there at the time of the secession vote, 23rd of May, 1861. So this was a remarkable thing, holding these poll books in my hands, right? Okay. All of them certified by Thomas Jackson. At that time, Thomas Jackson, later on, Stonewall Jackson. I was sitting there, my wife was bored or sitting there in the Library of Virginia, and I'm just going through documents. My wife says, "You find anything interesting yet?" Because she wanted to go to Myrtle Beach, right? She wanted to stay there and do research with me. And so I told her, well, here's the signature of Stonewall Jackson. It's kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah.
So, Art of Medical Records, Commanders. Oh, the Library of Congress has a wonderful site chronicling America. It gives you all kinds of newspapers. And so I could read newspapers from the time. I wanted to know what was in these ancestors' heads, what was feeding into their brains. And I learned a lot by reading these newspapers. Their local newspaper was the Staunton Spectator, and it was a Whig paper. It was not a Southern Democrat paper, was not a Northern Democrat paper, was not a Republican paper. Black Republican, they called it, in the South. And in, I guess, a border state like Virginia, even, they called these Republicans Black Republicans. It's kind of a double entendre. But it was a Whig paper, and they were pro-union. And during the presidential election of 1860, I found that the people in that community that they had voted 95% in favor of union candidates. Only 5% voted in favor of John Breckinridge, who was a Southern Democrat. Only 5% in that community. That community was strongly pro-union, but 6 months later, there were only, I think, 22 votes in favor of union, and the rest of the votes in the county were for secession. So you got to wonder what happened when you see information like this. First of all, there were like 700 fewer votes. It was only about 4,200 votes during the presidential election in the county, and so about 700 fewer votes. It's a significant drop. And I found some other data that kind of explains a lot more about why people didn't vote, and why people who did vote sometimes went there intending to vote for union, but voted for secession anyway. There are more records at the National Archives. I found these through a book titled Unionists in the Shenandoah Valley During the Civil War. And it contains records from the Southern Claims Commission. You see, Southerners who could prove that they were always loyal to the Union during the Civil War and had their property destroyed or stolen by the U.S. Army could claim damages and had been reimbursed for the lost property. Now, some of these people ended up testifying, and their testimony is still there at the National Archives. And some of it's been published in these books, like Unionists in the Shenandoah Valley. So I found out some interesting things from that book and from the records at the National Archives. First of all, their pastor was the Postmaster General on the Underground Railroad, which is kind of interesting. Also, you see, they were German Reformed, raised and born and bred German Reformed, and German Reformed was anti-slavery. And so that's how they were born and raised, I can tell. Also, other people who were in the Underground Railroad had their property destroyed by the U.S. Army during the raid of Phil Sheridan. Sheridan came down in 1864, and he destroyed everything that he couldn't ship north in the Shenandoah Valley down to about Staunton. It was said that if a crow flew over the valley, it would have to take its provisions with it. There was so much destruction in the Shenandoah Valley. They burned all the barns, any grain. This one guy who had a claim with the Southern Claims Commission said that when Sheridan came with his 20,000 horses in 2 hours, they came down like a horde of locusts, and in 2 hours, all of his cattle had been turned into bones and skins strewn about the farm. So, here's this guy, Abram Heatwall was his name, another guy on the Underground Railroad. He had risked his life and the life of his family to help ship Southern soldiers, Confederate soldiers, to the north to avoid service in the Confederate Army and perhaps join the Union Army, as my ancestors did, and had his property destroyed, and he's making a claim then for reimbursement, but he was not reimbursed. And the reason he wasn't is that they found his vote in the poll book that he had voted in favor of secession. Now, he had testimony by himself and other people about what happened when they went to the polls that morning. He said that when he got there were some guys with rifles and another guy with a noose. And they told the people arriving at the poll station that if they voted in favor of Union, that they would hang them now. And if they left without voting, they would drive them and their family out of the county. So he said he went there fully intending to vote for Union, but he voted for secession because of these threats. And there were a lot of other people who testified to the exact same thing. Okay. So that's the nature of the secession vote in many places in Virginia. In fact, if you read the newspapers tell you that you can vote for Union, but a vote for Union would be giving aid and comfort to the enemy, which is language in the United States Constitution for treason. And treason is punishable by death. Okay? So you read these sorts of things and you say to yourself, maybe I just won't vote this time. I'm going to stay home. Okay? And so it's remarkable what you can find by looking, right? What you can learn by reading. So there were not just the Staunton Spectator I read, which is a Whig paper. There's a Southern Democrat paper in Richmond. One thing I learned by reading all these newspapers, and I went back in time a little bit, I learned that starting in 1858, there was a militia movement. And this occurred not just in the South, but also in the North. And this was happening in response to what was going on in Kansas. The Kansas Bleeding Kansas incidents. And so they, starting in, say, March, the West Augusta Guard in Augusta County, Virginia, opened its operations in March of 1858. This is 3 years before the start of the Civil War. And all you read in the newspaper every month after that there was a marching competition over here, there was a shooting competition over there, and we had excellent marksmanship with our cannon over here, and the cavalry is doing this over there. And the marching band, which is a new thing at the time, you never saw that much brass anywhere until 1858 to 1861, all these marching bands having marching band competitions. This is something that was very visible to everyone. It was very visible to everyone that a certain militancy is arising, starting in 1858. So that's something I learned by this research, all this reading. I learned that from the newspapers. You don't learn that from your typical accounts from the Civil War. Civil War usually starts on the 12th of April, 1861. Maybe you can talk a little bit about secession going on since December 1860. But I also visited, I had records from Fort Sully in the Dakota Territories. And that was kind of interesting to obtain those records and have my great-great-grandfather as a loss in November on their rolls. He had been ill when he got to the Dakota Territory since September. And so they had to ship him that 300 miles, think about this, no roads, 300 miles back to Sioux City, Iowa, where he was in a hospital until November. And they had to release him or else he might have died even being in the hospital just because it's so cold. At that time, the Missouri River would freeze over at Sioux City, Iowa, making boat traffic impossible. You couldn't get the riverboats up to Sioux City anymore because of the ice in the Missouri River. That doesn't happen anymore. You can go a little bit further up. It doesn't melt there. You can't go too much further up because it becomes unnavigable. It's too shallow, too much further up. But that's why they had to disembark at Sioux City, Iowa. You can't navigate much further. And march from there 300 miles. He had to come back 300 miles to the hospital where he stayed for many months, where they kind of had an imperative to get him out of the area, no matter what state of recovery he was in, because it was going to be cold. Even in the hospital, there are going to be drafts. He might die. So they have to get him out before the river freezes over, so they released him 20th. Usually the river froze over about the first week of December. So they get him on the last river boat out of there and back home. Well, I say back home. Former Confederate soldier who joined the Union Army, does he ever go home? Is that even a remote possibility? Yeah, they never could go home. Actually, I say that he went home 3 times, but much later, about the 1890s. Okay. After the death of his former captain, who died kind of tragically and suddenly, but he was able to go back after that. I believe, from my research, that their mother was murdered by the father of the former captain. Their mother. And the reason for that belief is for several reasons. One, she sold a property in the middle of the Civil War, and it was paid off by the purchaser in 3 equal payments over the course of 2.5 years. The last payment came due the 25th of August, 1865. The problem being in August of 1865, the sale that had been denominated in Confederate dollars Confederate dollars are now worthless. So it went to her deceased husband's administrator, which was the father of their former captain, to determine the value of the payment that should be made. And he came up with about $20. This is for 111 acres. They sold 333 acres. So the third payment, worth about 111 acres, he calculated up $20. His son, remember, had been their captain, and his son had lost his left leg at the Battle of Winchester in 1864. So his son had permanent disability that he looked at every day, where her sons were off who knows where. And I think he took it out on her, $20. So she sued him. She went to court. And the final decision came down on the 22nd of November, 1866, and she won. She won additional monies, but the very next day she's dead. That's not the only evidence, the untimely nature of her death the day after she won a court battle against this guy. I also found that the property was illegally transferred to the buyer by John Newton. And I found that out because that was adjudicated in 1890. So by looking through those court records, I found out that he had illegally transferred the property, the deed, without Virginia state seals. And they fingered him. This is the guy who did this. You know, he's the one. They said it might have been a mistake, I don't know. But for whatever reason, the deed had to be cured, which it was in 1890. It's remarkable what you can find by looking. I had to visit the battlefield at the Spotsylvania Courthouse where Sam Grove was on the front lines. He was on the front lines in the first wave to attack the Confederate fortifications there about 5:45 in the morning. They say that they got halfway across the field and it was foggy, and halfway across the field the fog lifted. So they were totally exposed.
Yeah.
They were still very silent as 20,000 men can be going across the field. But the Green Unit came into some Confederate pickets, which are some men who are charged with, when they encounter the enemy, to fire one shot and then run. That unit thought they had encountered the main line, so they cheered because they thought they'd captured the main line, but they hadn't. And so the Confederates started firing at them because they were then aware of the encroaching Union soldiers. So they had to run forward. There's nothing you can do but run forward. Run backwards, you're going to be shot who knows how many times as you go across, half a mile of field. You have to go forward and try to get there before they can fire a second shot. So, and they captured, it's kind of funny, you see they had been part of the Stonewall Brigade when they were Confederate soldiers. But that morning, Sam went up against the Stonewall Brigade at that section of the line in Spotsylvania Courthouse. And the Stonewall Brigade was annihilated that day. It ceased to exist as a military unit. It was either, the soldiers were either killed or captured in almost entirety. There were about 250 men left in the brigade, perhaps assigned to different places away from the front line, so that's why they weren't killed or captured. But everyone else was killed or captured that day. So Sam went up against them. Who knows, they may have even recognized him. So, you never know. So I went to the battlefield, Spotsylvania Courthouse. Did I mention, well, we'll get to it. Church records. In particular, there's St. John's Church in Middlebrook, Virginia, that I got various records from, in addition to the records at Mount Carmel Presbyterian Church. These, I found kind of an interesting thing at Mount Carmel. You see, their mother had been German Reformed all their lives. But just before the secession vote, through profession of faith, she professed faith in the Presbyterian religion and joined the Presbyterian Church. And I racked my mind thinking, why did she do this? And I believe it's because she felt it would be a sign of solidarity with her sons who were already at Harper's Ferry, and a sign of support for them, even though they would later desert the Confederate army and come back and cause a lot of other problems, including a couple shootouts on the Homestead. But she actually did that along with her sister, Polly Zink. So she and her sister together. And you can kind of see some aftermath of this from where she's buried. Now, she joined the Presbyterian Church, had been German Reformed. The German Reformed actually met at Mount Carmel Presbyterian Church in kind of an ecumenical fashion, having their own services maybe on the side. So they met together, and they have separate cemeteries on the same plot, right? So you have the Presbyterian cemetery, and down on the lower ground you have the German Reformed cemetery. Now, you would think, having joined the Presbyterian Church, she'd be on the Presbyterian side, but she's not. She's on the German side. But she's not with the rest of the graves in that part of the cemetery. She's off in a lonely corner by herself with her sister Polly. You can see that rejection by both the Presbyterians and the German Reformed. that probably resulted from, first of all, her son's deserting, but also she rejecting the German Reformed Church and joining the Presbyterians. The Germans couldn't accept her back, put her in that corner by herself. You can go there and it's just so obvious. So it's a sad commentary just going to visit this grave about what this woman experienced during the Civil War and after. So cemetery records, I could not gain access to the Zink family cemetery, and that's where one of the fellow deserters, the one who was killed in the shootout, where he's buried in the Zink family cemetery. Their mother was Elizabeth Zink. So there are a lot of other local cemeteries and a lot of other people. There's a history of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, which was very, very useful in constructing this book because it gives stories that were told by the men. Each man was asked whom they could find and was willing to contribute, wrote something about their experiences during the Civil War. So you have these firsthand experiences being written by the guys, by the grunts on the ground, as well as the majors and the colonels and whatnot. They all give their accounts.
Jeff, was that searchable?
Yeah,
This
you can find the whole book online.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a fantastic read. I also read the history of the 53rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry because in the last month of the war, Sam was transferred to the 53rd from the 148th. But that was after the war was over. So what happened is the 148th was disbanded, except for those who still had a term of service under their 3-year bounties. And they were transferred to the 53rd, and then they were released after 1 month. So that's what initially the National Archives gave me, was the 1 month service by Sam, which tells essentially nothing. But yes, I told you about the book Unionists in the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War, which also has some interesting things to say about fraud. There was a guy in Lexington, Virginia, down by, it's well below Staunton, where Phil Sheridan did his raid down to Staunton, and that's it. Didn't go down to Lexington. There was a man there who applied for refund, for money from the U.S. government through the Southern Claims Commission, claiming he had property that was lost and that he was always loyal, but he was like the uncle to the governor during the war. Governor was John Letcher. This is an uncle to him who's claiming loss, always loyal. Well, probably not. So I don't think he received anything either. There were certain presidential pardons that I found after the Civil War. If you were a person in the South who owned property in excess of value of $10,000, you had to apply to the President of the United States for a special pardon in order to be allowed to vote or take part in public life in your community. So I found John Newton. He was the administrator of the state and possible murderer of my great-great-great-grandmother. Found his petition for presidential pardon, as well as his neighbor, William Gilkerson. I'll show you something about that later. I also found oaths of allegiance. Several family members fled Virginia and went to Pennsylvania, but they didn't join the Union Army, they just worked. But even so, they had to profess their loyalty to the government through signing an oath of allegiance to the United States. And so that's more documentation that I was able to find, that family members had gone that same route. These two, Jack and Sam, had actually joined the Union Army. Other family members had also gone north, but they didn't join the Army, they just worked. So I hiked up St. Mary's River, which is nearby, near the old homestead there at South Bottom. That's a beautiful site there in the Shenandoah Valley, the mountains of the Blue Ridge. You have wonderful flowers, foliage there, the mountain laurel. You have there's a wild rose that grows there and gives an incredible scent, just fills the air with the scent of rose. I hiked to the top of Big Spy Mountain, which is just behind the Grove homestead. It's place to hide out. They can't find you when you're up at the top of a big spy, and you can see everything. The Shenandoah Valley. I visited Fortress Monroe, reached out to different relatives, etc., and that's how I got the wanted poster, was by reaching out to people, writing letters, seeing if someone would respond. Had some nice correspondence with people all over the country, so that was nice too. Writing this book, it did require revisions to the storyline given new information. You get new information that contradicts something you wrote, you have to rewrite the darn story. But eventually, I got to the point where I had so much information, I figured I just have to sit down and write the darn book. Let's just write the thing. So goals was to organize and synthesize my thoughts. I also wanted to tell the true story, however it turned out, with no whitewashing. I wanted to explore moral decisions. There are certain turning points. Okay, why did they desert the Confederate Army and go home and not go north immediately? It's a moral decision point. It's an important one. How did they end up in the Confederate Army in the first place? How did they vote? Turns out they didn't vote for secession. They didn't vote at all. There were 200 soldiers there in that encampment who just chose not to vote. And there's one of the reasons being, you'll see soon. I also wanted to be able to present the research to anyone who cared to read it. So it had to be a novel. I figured nobody's going to read dry research. It has to have a storyline that people can read and follow. And so here they are. There's Jack, and there's Sam. Okay. That's so. This is my great-great-grandfather, and this is his brother.
Wow. That's incredible. $30
This is the $30 reward poster. I don't know if you can see, 7 names here: James G. Carrier, Thomas M. Croson, Samuel K. Grow, Andrew J. Grow. He went by Jack. Cornelius Ham, Elisha Weeks, and Andrew J. Zink. So, James G. Carrier had married Andrew Zink's sister. Okay, so they're kind of related. In-laws. Andrew Zink was their cousin, Sam and Jack's cousin. Thomas M. Croson, on Valentine's Day, 1861, married Isabella Grow, their cousin. Okay, so he's related in that way. That's kind of an in-law. Cornelius Ham is not related, but he's on here because he took a bounty in exchange for a furlough and never came back from the furlough, and that's the reason why he's here. Elisha Weeks joined the Army in March of 1862. When I say join, I mean conscripted. He deserted 7th of May, 1862, and was with them when the reward poster was issued. He was killed on the 8th of October, 1862, in a shootout on the Homestead. In that shootout, one of the provost guard, William Height, was wounded, trying to arrest him. There was an earlier shootout on the 25th of July. This is August 7th, 1862, the date of the wanted poster, August 7th. Just before that, there had been a shootout on the Homestead with provost guard trying to arrest them. One of the provost guard was wounded. His name was Robert Samuel Galladay, Sam Galladay, he went by his middle name. Sam Galladay actually deserted the Confederate Army in December of 1862 and joined the U.S. forces in Tennessee. So even those being sent to collect deserters weren't necessarily not sympathetic to them. They may have been quite sympathetic to the deserters, but they're there to arrest them, and so Sam was shot trying to arrest them in July 25th, 1862. This obviously was printed as a response to that shooting. And so down to their wanted men. Later on, so they're hiding in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Later on in October, Elisha is caught and shot in a shootout where William Height At the time, Elisha Weeks' wife was 2 months pregnant. So one of the questions that I had was, what happened to the baby? Okay. So the baby was born in May of 1863, named Henry Elisha Weeks. Well, 35 years later, Henry Elisha Weeks was murdered by Benjamin Height, the nephew of William Height, who shot his father. It's kind of amazing what you can find if you decide to look. That's a complicated and interesting story in its own right. So here's Fort Monroe. You can see the wall of the fort and the moat. There's a moat. Yeah, that's water. You can see it better perhaps if I turn this light off. Yeah. The moat around the fort, Fort Monroe, they had cannon up here. This is the Lincoln gun. The Lincoln gun weighs 49,099 pounds. Okay, this is a massive beast. They mounted it on its mount weighed 80 tons. So this is a massive gun. If the earth were a bell, this would be the clapper. You can send this off and it rings the earth. So, this is a page from the poll book.
Wow.
At the military encampment at Harper's Ferry. And one of the reasons that you might not want to put your name over here for rejection of the ordinance of secession is here you have Colonel Kenton Harper, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Harmon, Major William Smithhanger Baylor, and so on. You have the officers of the regiment signing first. Do you want your name to be right here across from the colonel's?
Not really.
How about that, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that good for you? Right here? And they have a permanent record. They can see how you voted. You know, what assignments are you going to have? Where are you going to serve? What kind of duty are you going to have?
Penmanship's basic.
Like I say, they had a private and a sergeant supervising the private at a table, writing down the names. And they were very careful how they did this. So I went through and I typed all of these names into a spreadsheet. I discovered 8 errors in the vote, 7 of which they caught, 1 of which they did not. They skipped, you see they've numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. They skipped 7 different numbers as they went along. But they caught those skipped numbers. What they didn't catch is a repeated number. Okay. So their enumeration was off by 1. They should have added 1 in favor to secession. Here we are. This is my wife's thumb holding this document at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, right? And this is the book that is at the Library of Virginia in Richmond for the applications for exemption to the Confederate draft. All applications for exemption to the Confederate draft were in this book, captured by a U.S. Army officer at the Fall of Richmond, and now preserved, of course, at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. There were also these handwritten sheets that were written out and signed by justices of the peace or sheriffs for various people who had paid a fee in order to avoid the draft, say $300 or $400. Okay. So at the time you could do that. Later on in the war, the manpower situation was so desperate on the part of the Confederates that they canceled all of those. Even if you had paid it, sorry, you're drafted. I went through each and every single one of those. This is a big project, right? This is a big.
Yeah.
This is South Bottom. South Bottom is actually a river. There's two rivers called South Bottom. This is the South River of the James, and only a couple miles away is the South River of the Shenandoah. South River of the Shenandoah heads north, South River of the James heads south, but they meet again at Hampton Roads as they go out to the sea. Kind of a metaphor for what happened in this story. So, but this is the actual river in a photograph taken in May by myself of the South River of the James that they grew up around. That's the reason this is called South Bottom. Bottoms are rich agricultural land next to rivers that are running parallel to mountain ranges like this, water coming out of the mountain. you get very rich farmland adjacent to it. The best lands are the bottoms. So this is South Bottom because it's by the South River of the James. It's the bottomlands by the South River of the James. So that's the reason. The road next to it is called South Bottom Road. They grew up on South Bottom Road. This is a oath of allegiance to the United States. This is a petition for pardon from the President of the United States with a comic drawn on it by the author here. Yeah, it says a hoop-de-doo-doo of Murder Bay. This is by a guy named William Gilkerson. William Gilkerson was a septuagenarian who was wealthy and had to apply for a pardon from the President of the United States. And so, what is he implying here, a hoop-de-doo-doo Murder Bay? Murder Bay was an area of Washington, D.C. that was well known for its prostitution. In fact, that's where hookers' men would spend their afternoons with the ladies of the night there, and that's how the term hooker came about. These are hookers' men. The ladies of the night became known as hookers' division. So that's where the term hooker comes from. It's amazing what you learn going through this. But that's not the reason this is there. Murder Bay was also a place where they had playhouses, and one of the plays was a minstrel act called a hoop-de-doo-doo. A minstrel act, if you don't know, is a white man in blackface acting out stereotypical behaviors of black people. And this particular play was about a man who was freed by his master, and for every good thing that happened to him, something bad also happened. Okay, so that's what's going on with hoop-de-doo-doo. Why did William Gilkerson put this here? Because he's being forced as a white man to beg pardon of his masters like a black man. That's why. It's a minstrel act. A hoop-de-doo-doo murder day. Okay.
So he's making a comment out of that.
Yeah, he's showing his contempt for the process of applying for presidential pardon. Right here on the application for presidential pardon. But these went to the governor, who then sent them on to the president. The governor said, I recommend the pardon of the petitioner, signed by the Governor Pierpont after the Civil War. So,
Did the president actually see that?
Did they really see
Yeah.
it that way?
yeah, there it is. All right. So,
But did the president,
I don't know. The president probably didn't see it. Right? He probably just received the recommendation from the governor.
He
Just
didn't get
signed
the
up.
joke.
Yeah. So, I found interesting documents like this tear-stained letter by one of the family members. This relates to the marriage of Isabella Grow to Thomas M. Croson. Isabella was 15 years old at the time. This was not a very happy event for her mother, Margaret Grow, who was a phonetic speller, by the way. She wrote it
I was
out,
gonna say.
Margaret
Yeah, I was gonna say
Grow.
that, though.
Even Margaret, that's not the usual spelling of Margaret, right? She was a very phonetic speller, but her son, James Grow, spelled it G-R-O-A-H. So that's her son. They're spelling it differently. But in any case, these
Did
are
you
the
say that
flags.
was tear stain? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
How do you know that?
Well, that's hard to tell. You don't see that many smudges typically on a letter like this submitted to a court. So, in any case,
It's also sort of the distribution of them too.
you know.
Yeah, there's more straight, I agree with, yeah, where the eyes are, yeah.
So these are the flags they fought under, starting with the Confederate side. There's the stars and bars, the national flag of the Confederacy at the beginning of the war. This is the flag of the 5th Virginia Infantry, and this is the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. And here's the first division flag of 2nd Corps that Sam fought under, and this is their 4th Brigade flag with their little, they call it a trefoil. The 2nd Corps, they called themselves the Clubs of Trumps. Clubs of Trumps. Okay, that was their motto. Clubs. See, clubs. Okay, clubs of Trumps. Okay, so and then my great-great-grandfather was under the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery. This is similar to the the flag for the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry that Sam fought under. I have to show you this one because if I showed you the actual flag, it would contain about this much of it. They were through such hard service, there was very precious little of it left. Okay. At the end, this being a Google Earth map of the battlefield at Spotsylvania Courthouse. So you can see Sam with his regiment went in right here across the field, attacked and destroyed the Stonewall Brigade, marched in Union line across to here, the bloody angle over here. They were forced back by 6 a.m. to the original line. They were called over at 9 a.m. to come back around here where they fought for the remainder of the day at the bloody angle. So that's where Sam was on the 12th of May, 1864. And I met a lot of people along the way. There were a lot of people that I encountered along the way. Here's the minister that married Isabella, for instance. That's Isabella right there. Just a lot of people along the way that I encountered. You can recognize a lot of them, and some of them you won't. You will recognize Mary Grow, their sister, or Christiana, their other sister. And here's the Battle of the 100, where they went in and captured that Confederate fort and were driven out. And here's the Battle of Ream Station that Sam was at, which was devastating the Second Corps. It was a terrible loss. Confederates were almost defeated. They said the Confederates marched across almost in perfect order like at Gettysburg, but they won this battle. A lot of maps. You can't do a book on warfare without having a lot of maps.
Yeah.
Some of which I had to pay to use, like this battle map for Ream Station. A lot of newspaper stuff. There's the a depiction of the fort at Fort Sully that Jack went to in the Dakota Territories. Notice the Native American encampment right outside. They were given military protection by the U.S. government. Who were they being protected from? They were being protected from other Native tribes that would have annihilated them had they had the chance. And there was a lot more that went into this book. We can only scratch the surface here, but I thank you for coming.
Thank you.